I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Movie Star Magic. And this week, we're going to be looking at one of the great career stretches in the 90s, and then sort of how that evolved in the career of the great action star, the great sports movie star, the great actor, Wesley Snipes. But if you are new to the series, which you most likely are, as this is a brand new series, just in our 4th episode, what I do every single week is break down the show into 2 parts. The first part, essentially giving the career arc of the actor. I break the actor's career into 3 separate chapters and talk about a defining role in each of those chapters to try to evolve and try to understand how the actor evolved and how their sort of career changed and what they're great at and the sort of different avenues of their career to explore what makes them a great actor. And then ultimately, in the second half of the video, talking about their defining feature. What is that one thing or a couple things that they bring to each character, to each role, that they pretty much always brought to the characters that makes them unique, that makes them special, that makes them great? Usually it's the title of the video, but it's always sort of the main reason as to why I want to do this series, to ultimately track the influence of actors onto movies, whereas most of the time we look at directors and their sort of singular vision and how that shapes the movie, but oftentimes I want to look at the actors and what they're bringing. And oftentimes when we're looking in this sort of 90s star system, Wesley Snipes is sort of at the height of it, where particularly, even in the 90s, we had the stars really sort of dictating what types of movies were getting made, what types of movies they were in, and they had just as much, if not more, influence than, say, the directors of this time period. Now, jumping into the career arc, Wesley Snipes is a really fascinating guy because he has a pretty quick rise and stays there for a little bit, and I'd say pretty much the 90s was his decade, and all the movies I'm going to be talking about were in this sort of 10-year period of 89 to 99, and then from there on it's sort of an interesting sort of fall, but ultimately the show is about the celebration of actors, so I'm going to be talking about this great period. And the first chapter that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to deem the supporting standout chapter, and that is, I'd say, pretty much from 89, when he got sort of first real break in Major League, all the way up until 91, where we're talking about, you have him as a supporting role in King of New York, and then even in something like Mo Better Blues, where he's playing opposite Denzel Washington in these supporting roles and really standing out in a lot of them. Oftentimes playing up against another actor, but very much the sort of co-lead or the sort of supporting role. King of New York, he's a supporting role, very much so, in Major League, supporting role, but doing so and really excelling at that. So ultimately, my defining movie of this chapter, I went with Major League, because even though I'm not a huge fan of the movie, he is the funniest part of the movie without a doubt. He steals every scene, and he's one of these guys where certain people like Julia Roberts, or modern day equivalent, I think would be like a Timothy Chalamet or Florence Pugh. You see them early on, and you go like, oh wow. I remember seeing Florence Pugh in Lady Macbeth and being like, oh wow, that's a star. There's something sort of undeniable about it. And when you see Wesley Snipes here, in even this just small role in Major League, he kills every scene, his line deliveries. And it's funny to think that this could have been his career of just being in these kind of comedies. He could have been sort of an Adam Sandler-esque comedic leading man, even though he really doesn't sort of lean totally into the comedy a lot of times after this, sort of more into the action, more into the serious, although of course always has sort of jokey, funny parts of most of his characters. So just showing up, being one of the best parts of a great comedic movie at the time, that's a sort of real sort of step out there, and in these sort of supporting standout roles. I really liked him in Mo Better Blues as well. He is just this really interesting, fascinating guy that can work within the movie, but very clearly is obviously the guy, which transitions nicely into the second chapter, which I'm going to deem the movie star, which oftentimes it doesn't mean, oh, he's the only movie star. Oftentimes in this period, he's the co-star. He's sort of doing these sort of two-handers, these dual lead movies, but often which he is very much clearly the movie star. He is the best thing of those movies, and even though he's going up against a Sean Connery in A Rising Sun, or a Woody Harrelson in White Man Can't Jump, or a Demolition Man, going up against Sylvester Stallone, I think he's the best part of pretty much all of those movies. And I think in the sort of the dual sort of star movies, he sort of clearly defines himself. He's not the supporting standout anymore. He is the movie star. He is the sort of top billed kind of a guy, and works well though going off against those guys. And really, if you look at his career, his 89 to 90 run is sort of that supporting standout time, and then pretty quickly his 91 to 93 range is incredible. And I just want to read you his list of his 90s, going from not even his full 90s, just 89 to 93. So 4 years he does 11 movies, and pretty much all of them I can recommend. So if you look at this, so from 89 to 93 he has Major League, King of New York, Mo Better Blues, New Jack City, Jungle Fever, The Water Dance, White Man Can't Jump, Passenger 57, Bowling Point, Rising Sun, Demolition Man. And, not all of them are super standouts, but even certain movies like Passenger 57 are really good. He's really terrific in The Water Dance if you haven't seen that one. And of course, classics like New Jack City and Demolition Man and Mo Better Blues. It's like right away he jumps up in Major League in 89, and then within 4 years he does 11 movies, and a lot of them are classics. That's sort of, in my opinion, one of the best runs in movie history, compared to Tom Hanks' 90s as well is another one. Gene Hackman had a good run sort of at late 80s there too. So he's just one of these guys where he had this one period where he was just totally dominant and made classic after classic and was just in the zone. So the chapters are sort of split up, but throughout this sort of short period, he really does sort of evolve as an actor, like I said in chapter 1, from the supporting standout to the movie star. And in the second chapter of those sort of co-lead kind of movies where he's the movie star and uses his charisma, I had to go with his defining role being White Man Can't Jump. And for me, this may be his defining role out of every chapter, just because I think it sort of exemplifies a lot of what makes him great. He's super charismatic, super charming. He can have the sort of funny elements that he displayed in Major League with some of the trash talking that he does with Woody, but some of the serious moments, of course, in the sort of confrontations with Woody Harrelson and some of the trouble that they get into. But I also think he has incredible control of his body, and we'll talk about that sort of athletic prowess a little bit later. But what's so fascinating about it is that he apparently was sort of taught to do basketball in this movie, and that he wasn't a very good athlete and baseball player in Major League. Yet when you watch this movie, there is something sort of, I think, balletic to his physical form and to the way he sort of carries himself and his sort of body control. Of course, we see that later in a lot of the action movies, Passenger 57 and Blade. But White Man Can't Jump sort of fits in the sort of athletic part, the fact that he is a sports kind of a guy. I mean, there's a guy that Wesley Snipes is one of the sort of all-time, I think, sports athletes, movie athletes at least. I mean, in terms of just, being in Major League Baseball, White Man Can't Jump, basketball, The Fan, football. There are these sort of benchmarks that he's played. He's played an athlete many times, and I think he's good at doing that. So has the charisma, allows him to be funny, but also allows him to be a little bit more serious. And I think that sort of playful, intense, joking around, heavy on the charisma Snipes persona is always the best of him. He tries to do some stuff more seriously in something like Jungle Fever, which he is successful at, but when he's a little bit more charming and cool in his small part in Waiting to Exhale, or Demolition Man when he's over the top and crazy, all those movies I think I really enjoy. But ultimately I had to go with his defining role being White Man Can't Jump, although I almost went Demolition Man. That's a little bit of a guilty pleasure of mine. That one's a solid movie, and he is just so terrific and over the top in that. But ultimately, now transitioning to chapter 3 of his career, which I would deem the lone hero. So he started off supporting standout, then he started doing these co-leads, and I think pretty much from 98 onwards, he started to be the guy. So when you see a movie like The Art of War, it's him. When you see a movie like Blade, there's not, there's Stephen Dorff, but that's not really Sean Connery, right? It's just him. And even a movie like U.S. Marshals, where he's opposite Tommy Lee Jones, pretty much the entire movie he's by himself. And what it shows us is that he can be cool. That before it was just, I'm the trash talker, I'm the big mouth, I'm the charismatic guy. But in U.S. Marshals, he barely speaks. He's a sort of lone killer. And in Blade, same thing. Lone killer, doesn't speak, serious. And I think that sort of opened up another career avenue of his acting and of his career later on, of course, with the Blade franchise being so successful. And ultimately I went with his defining role being in this chapter, Blade. And I think this is a fascinating point and a demarcation point in American cinema as well as Wesley Snipes' career. Because if you look at Wesley Snipes' 90s, you go, oh, I am Wesley Snipes. I am the sort of #1 movie star. I will open up a movie. It will say, you know, Snipes, Stallone, Demolition Man, and that will be enough to sell a movie. Where we get Blade in 98, and it's like, well, actually, it's not Wesley Snipes that's selling the movie, it's Blade that's selling the movie. I'm Blade, the intellectual property, the sort of comic book character. I'm Wesley Snipes, the actor who plays Blade, but ultimately, Blade is opening up the name, not Wesley Snipes. So there's sort of a demarcation where we're actually transitioning from movie stars to franchise entertainment, and it's fascinating to see just how much Blade, I think, predicted modern day cinema, particularly with sort of superhero domination of the modern box office. It's fascinating to see Wesley Snipes being really at the forefront of that and using this franchise as a sort of way to exercise his influence without also realizing that this will be the future of cinema in many regards. But like I said, Blade sort of helps define him being the sort of cool action hero. He doesn't have to rely on his knowing charisma. He can just look there, look cool, be in great shape, and kick people, and you know what, that's enough. And that's what a lot of this movie is, just him kicking people and karate chopping people, and he's terrific at doing that while also looking cool. And I think that's what the movie was made for, and I think the movie totally succeeds in doing that. And Wesley Snipes is one of those actors now at the end where, you know, he was someone I really wanted to cover because of his sort of great 90s run, which I don't think is talked about enough. But he's also a guy that we have in Dolomite Is My Name, Coming to America. He's starting to have a little bit of a career resurgence, so I don't think his career's over. There could be a 4th chapter that I could add on to this video. But I think because of sort of the issues with taxes and certain sort of prickliness on set, I think there's a certain Wesley Snipes that has to make a comeback now versus when he didn't before, and he's clearly a terrific actor. You know, he was going up against Denzel and beating Denzel in the 90s, and Denzel's still doing great things, so I would like to see Snipes get back into that zone, and I do think he can do that. So with encouraging performances in sort of Dolomite Is My Name, being in bigger movies like Coming to America, there is an excitement, at least on my part, that he will get back to that. But truthfully, his 2000s, because he spent time in jail, because he was dealing with that, he didn't act as much as ultimately I'd like. And of course, a string of flops as well didn't help. Art of War, things like that. Even something like The Fan, which wasn't the high mark of cinema. So there's certain elements that you wish we saw more Snipes, but I do think, you know, we can still see more of him. And then now talking about his defining feature, the title of this video is Wesley Snipes the Athlete, which is maybe a little bit ironic because you read out these stories about him on Major League and how, you know, they didn't allow him to throw the ball in the movie because he doesn't really throw a baseball very well, or White Man Can't Jump, he's not a terrific athlete just, you know, throwing a basketball. But what's fascinating about him is I think that's sort of the more sports element, but also his sort of, I would combine that with his sort of stunt work and his athletic prowess, which I think is clear in a lot of his movies. Despite him not being able to necessarily be good at sports, his body control, I think, is really terrific. And sort of clear scene that sort of defined that to me is in Passenger 57, which is sort of an interesting, sort of generic-ish but well-done action movie where it's a very simple scene. He's sort of he's just running out of a building, opens the door. There's probably a fence, a 5-foot tall fence, goes up to his chest, that he just sort of casually walks up to, leaps over, and just continues going on. I mean, he jumps maybe 5 feet in the air. He doesn't grab put his hands on the pole and sort of propel himself over. No, he's just running. He uses both his legs just to jump over, very casually lands, and just continues on running. And you look at it and you go like, no other actor could do that. Tom Cruise couldn't do that. Tom Hanks couldn't do that. You know, a generic actor couldn't do that. And then a sort of stunt work heavy actor, you know, except for maybe Jackie Chan is the only person I can really think of that could do that. And what that does ultimately is add to his acting, because, you know, there's a reason why I think Snipes sort of favored action movies over something like Jungle Fever, which he had that experience early on in his career. But I think when you have this sort of terrific martial arts background, which he does, and athletic prowess and control of your body, why not be in these action movies where you can do your own stunts, where you can do a lot of the action and the kicking? And what does that do? Well, it puts the audience into the character. He's actually utilizing his strengths and making us sort of understand him even more. Because when I see him just simply leap over the thing in Passenger 57, I go, oh, this guy can totally take down the terrorists. This guy can totally make it happen. There's just a believability that you don't have to hide his sort of stunt work through edits and stunt doubles and things like that. And when, same thing, you know, with Tom Cruise in the Mission Impossible movies, when you see him hanging off the side of the plane, it just adds a certain level of believability and realism because he's actually doing it, and you see it's Tom Cruise, so therefore it adds to his character depth in terms of, oh, that's really Ethan Hunt doing it. It's not Tom Cruise, the actor, playing Ethan Hunt. It is Ethan Hunt. In the same way, I think Snipes brings that sort of level of believability and that realism and that groundedness to a lot of his characters, just because he's able to do these sort of terrific physical stunts. So whether it be his martial arts background that he utilizes in some of the sports movies, or even just, you know, him kicking people in Blade, it really is cool to see. It really is something that's also, I think, adding to his charisma and to his acting talent and ability. So when I thought of his movies, I was like, this guy's the best athlete actor maybe I've ever seen. You see some like John David Washington in Tenet was probably the most recent example, where he's running, he's doing all the stunts, and you're like, wow, this guy is physical. This guy really feels like the character because he's really able to embody that physical element in it. And very few actors have that. And I think Wesley Snipes is one of those sort of few actors. So when I was watching his movies, I was like, wow, whether it be sort of his excellence in fight choreography, or his terrific charisma, of course, but ultimately that sort of that X factor, that's something that he has that other people don't have, in his ability to have just incredible body control, and I think athletic talent and physical talent for sure. But that's been it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and until next time, stay tuned.